What makes 1960s ghost stories so compelling for modern rewatching isn't just their historical significance, but how they establish the psychological frameworks that still define effective horror today. Today, we're going to explore 17 films that didn't just scare audiences, they redefined what supernatural horror could accomplish as an art form. Let's begin our journey into the shadows of the 1960s, where the dead don't always stay buried, and living isn't always what they seem. The Innocence, 1961. Jack Clayton's The Innocence stands as perhaps the most sophisticated ghost story ever filmed, transforming Henry James's The Turn of the Screw into a masterpiece of psychological ambiguity. What makes this film essential for rewatching is how it operates on multiple levels simultaneously, revealing new layers of meaning with each viewing while never definitively answering the central question: are the ghosts real? Or is governess Miss Giddens experiencing a psychological breakdown? The genius of The Innocence lies in its understanding that supernatural horror is most effective when it mirrors internal psychological states. Deborah Kerr's performance as Miss Giddens creates a character whose repressed sexuality and rigid moral framework might be manifesting as supernatural persecution. Yet the film provides just enough objective evidence of ghostly activity to maintain doubt about her sanity, creating a viewing experience that forces audiences to become active interpreters rather than passive consumers. What rewards repeated viewing is the film's extraordinary attention to visual and auditory detail. Cinematographer Freddie Francis uses deep focus photography and strategic lighting to create images where supernatural presences might be lurking in any shadow or reflection. The sound design layers whispers, wind, and unexplained noises in ways that suggest presence without confirmation, training viewers to listen for clues that may or may not exist. The film's exploration of corrupted innocence through the children, Miles and Flora, operates on both supernatural and psychological levels. Their sophisticated behavior and knowledge of adult secrets could result from ghostly possession or from exposure to adult sexuality and violence in their previous caretaker's relationship. This ambiguity transforms every interaction between Miss Giddens and the children into a complex negotiation between protection and projection, care and control. The Haunting, 1963. Robert Wise's The Haunting demonstrates how architecture itself can become a character in supernatural horror, creating a viewing experience where the very geometry of Hill House seems designed to drive its inhabitants toward madness. Based on Shirley Jackson's The Haunting of Hill House, the film transforms a ghost story into an exploration of how physical spaces can reflect and amplify psychological disturbance. The brilliance of The Haunting lies in its understanding that the most effective supernatural experiences emerge from the intersection of vulnerable psychology and oppressive environment. Eleanor Lance, played with heartbreaking vulnerability by Julie Harris, arrives at Hill House already psychologically fragile from years of caring for an invalid mother. The house doesn't create her instability, but rather provides a framework for her existing psychological conflicts to manifest as supernatural experiences. What makes this film essential for rewatching is how Wise uses camera angles, lighting, and set design to create a sense of architectural wrongness that operates below the threshold of conscious awareness. Hill House features doors that won't stay open, hallways that seem to bend at impossible angles, and rooms where the geometry feels subtly but disturbingly wrong. These design choices create a viewing experience where the house feels alive and malevolent without requiring any supernatural special effects. Carnival of Souls, 1962. Herc Harvey's Carnival of Souls operates as both supernatural horror and existential nightmare, creating a viewing experience that becomes more unsettling with familiarity rather than less. Made on a minimal budget with a largely amateur cast, the film achieves effects that bigger productions couldn't match through its understanding of how isolation and identity confusion can manifest as supernatural experience. The power of Carnival of Souls lies in its protagonist, Mary Henry's ambiguous relationship with reality following her survival of a car accident. Candice Hilligos delivers a performance that suggests psychological detachment that might be trauma response, supernatural limbo, or gradual realization of death. This uncertainty creates a viewing experience where every interaction becomes a question about the nature of existence and connection. What rewards repeated viewing is the film's systematic exploration of alienation in American society. Mary's inability to connect with other people, her lack of response to music despite being a church organist, and her attraction to an abandoned carnival pavilion suggest both supernatural displacement and psychological commentary on modern isolation. The film works simultaneously as ghost story and social criticism, examining how individuals can become spiritually dead while still physically alive. Black Sunday, 1960. Mario Bava's Black Sunday, originally La Maschera del Demonio, revolutionized supernatural horror by combining gothic atmosphere with explicit sexuality and violence, creating a template for how ghost stories could explore themes of desire, power, and revenge. The film's story of a witch returning from the dead to claim her descendant's body operates on multiple levels of metaphorical meaning while delivering genuine supernatural scares. The genius of Black Sunday lies in its understanding that supernatural horror is most effective when it taps into fundamental anxieties about sexuality, mortality, and family inheritance. Princess Ace's return from death represents not just supernatural vengeance, but the way that repressed sexual desires and family traumas can manifest across generations. Her possession of her look-alike descendant Katia suggests both literal supernatural threat and metaphorical exploration of how women inherit patterns of sexual oppression and rebellion. What makes this film essential for rewatching is Bava's revolutionary cinematography, which creates gothic atmosphere through lighting, composition, and practical effects that remain more effective than most contemporary CGI. The film's black and white photography uses shadows and fog to create spaces where supernatural and psychological realities intersect, while the detailed production design creates a world where ancient curses feel plausible within the logic of aristocratic decay. Burn, Witch, Burn, 1962. Sidney Hayer's Burn, Witch, Burn, released as Night of the Eagle in the UK, explores what happens when rational, educated individuals encounter supernatural forces that challenge their fundamental assumptions about reality. Based on Fritz Leiber's novel Conjure Wife, the film creates a viewing experience where academic skepticism gradually gives way to terrifying acceptance of magical reality. The brilliance of Burn, Witch, Burn lies in its systematic deconstruction of rationalist assumptions through the character of Norman Taylor, a psychology professor who discovers that his wife has been using witchcraft to advance his career. Peter Wyngarde's performance creates a character whose intellectual arrogance and commitment to scientific materialism make him initially unsympathetic, but his gradual acceptance of supernatural reality becomes a journey that mirrors the audience's own suspension of disbelief. What rewards repeated viewing is the film's sophisticated exploration of how supernatural belief systems operate within modern academic and social environments. The witchcraft practiced by the Fackelwives isn't presented as primitive superstition, but as an alternative knowledge system that proves more effective than conventional approaches to achieving social goals. This creates a viewing experience where supernatural elements serve as commentary on the limitations of purely rational approaches to understanding human behavior and social dynamics. The City of the Dead, 1960. John Llewellyn Moxey's The City of the Dead, known as Horror Hotel in the US, combines supernatural horror with social commentary about tourism, education, and the commodification of historical tragedy. The film's story of a college student researching witchcraft who becomes trapped in a town frozen in supernatural time creates multiple layers of meaning about knowledge, power, and exploitation. The power of The City of the Dead lies in its exploration of how academic research can become complicit with the forces it seeks to study. Nan Barlow's college paper on witchcraft leads her to Whitewood, Massachusetts, where she discovers that her professor has been in supernatural alliance with the witch he claims to study objectively. This betrayal of academic trust creates a horror story about the corruption of educational institutions and the dangers of treating supernatural forces as mere subjects of intellectual inquiry. What makes this film essential for rewatching is its atmospheric creation of Whitewood as a place where past and present coexist in supernatural suspension. The town operates as both tourist destination and supernatural trap, where visitors seeking historical atmosphere become literal sacrifices to maintain the witch's immortality. This creates a viewing experience that functions as both supernatural horror and commentary on how historical tragedy can be packaged as entertainment for contemporary consumption. 13 Ghosts, 1960. William Castle's 13 Ghosts represents the intersection of supernatural horror and theatrical showmanship, using the director's famous Illusion-O gimmick to create a viewing experience that acknowledges its own artificiality while delivering genuine supernatural scares. The film's story of a family inheriting a haunted house creates traditional ghost story elements while experimenting with audience participation techniques. The genius of 13 Ghosts lies in its understanding that supernatural horror can be enhanced, rather than diminished by acknowledging its constructed nature. Castle's Illusion-O system provided audiences with special glasses that could reveal or hide the ghosts depending on which filter they used, creating an interactive experience that made viewers active participants in determining how much supernatural content they wanted to see. This gimmick transforms the viewing experience into a negotiation between skepticism and belief that mirrors the character's own relationship with supernatural forces. What rewards repeated viewing is the film's surprisingly sophisticated exploration of grief, family dynamics, and economic anxiety within its supernatural framework. The Zorba family's inheritance of Cyrus Zorba's house comes with both financial salvation and supernatural danger, creating a scenario where economic desperation forces characters to accept supernatural risk. This combination of practical and supernatural concerns creates a horror story that acknowledges how financial pressure can make people accept dangerous situations they would otherwise avoid. The Devil Rides Out, 1968. Terence Fisher's The Devil Rides Out, based on Dennis Wheatley's novel, creates a supernatural horror story that operates as spiritual warfare between clearly defined forces of good and evil. The film's exploration of occult practices and Christian protection creates a viewing experience where supernatural elements serve both as horror entertainment and as genuine exploration of spiritual belief systems. The brilliance of The Devil Rides Out lies in its commitment to treating supernatural forces as real spiritual powers rather than psychological projections or social metaphors. Christopher Lee's performance as the Duc de Richelieu creates a character whose knowledge of occult practices serves protective rather than predatory purposes, representing wisdom and spiritual authority used to defend innocence against supernatural corruption. This positive use of occult knowledge creates a viewing experience where supernatural elements operate within a clear moral framework. What makes this film essential for rewatching is its systematic exploration of different supernatural protection methods and their effectiveness against specific occult threats. The film presents prayers, protective circles, holy water, and spiritual symbols as practical tools for supernatural defense, creating a worldview where spiritual warfare operates according to consistent rules and principles. This systematic approach to supernatural defense creates viewing experiences where audiences can evaluate the effectiveness of different spiritual strategies. Rosemary's Baby, 1968. Roman Polanski's Rosemary's Baby revolutionized supernatural horror by grounding fantastic elements in realistic social environments, creating a viewing experience where supernatural conspiracy emerges from the mundane details of urban apartment living. The film's exploration of pregnancy, marriage, and social isolation creates multiple layers of horror that operate simultaneously on supernatural and psychological levels. The genius of Rosemary's Baby lies in its understanding that the most effective supernatural horror emerges from the corruption of trusted social institutions and relationships. Rosemary's supernatural persecution comes not from external monsters, but from her husband, neighbors, and medical professionals, creating a horror story where the very people who should provide protection and support become agents of supernatural threat. This betrayal of social trust creates viewing experiences where paranoia becomes both symptom and survival strategy. What rewards repeated viewing is the film's meticulous attention to detail in creating a realistic social environment where supernatural elements can operate undetected. The Bramford apartment building serves as both authentic New York residential space and supernatural stronghold, with its elderly residents representing both typical urban neighbors and members of a generational occult conspiracy. This dual reality creates a viewing experience where audiences must constantly negotiate between social realism and supernatural threat. The Witches, 1966. Cyril Frankel's The Witches, based on Nora Lofts' novel The Devil's Own, creates supernatural horror through the conflict between Christian civilization and surviving pagan practices in rural English communities. The film's exploration of ancient religious survivals operating within contemporary rural society creates multiple layers of cultural and spiritual conflict. The power of The Witches lies in its treatment of witchcraft as an authentic religious practice rather than mere supernatural entertainment, creating a viewing experience where occult elements represent genuine spiritual alternative to Christian orthodoxy. Joan Fontaine's performance as Gwen Mayfield, a schoolteacher recovering from a nervous breakdown, creates a character whose psychological vulnerability makes her particularly sensitive to supernatural forces that other characters cannot perceive or acknowledge. What makes this film essential for rewatching is its systematic exploration of how ancient religious practices can survive within seemingly Christian communities through family traditions, seasonal celebrations, and rural customs that maintain pagan meanings beneath Christian forms. The film presents witchcraft not as evil supernatural force, but as alternative spiritual system that conflicts with Christian attempts to control rural communities through education, medicine, and religious authority. The film's treatment of rural English village life creates an authentic social environment where supernatural elements emerge from genuine cultural tensions between traditional rural practices and modern urban influences. The village school serves as the battleground between Christian education and pagan tradition, with children caught between competing spiritual and cultural systems that offer different approaches to understanding human relationships with natural and supernatural forces. The Mask of the Red Death, 1964. Roger Corman's The Mask of the Red Death, based on Edgar Allan Poe's story, creates supernatural horror through the exploration of aristocratic decadence and divine justice, using Vincent Price's performance and rich visual design to create a viewing experience where supernatural elements serve both as horror entertainment and moral commentary. The brilliance of The Mask of the Red Death lies in its understanding that supernatural horror is most effective when it emerges from moral and spiritual corruption, rather than arbitrary supernatural threat. Prince Prospero's attempts to escape the Red Death through wealth, isolation, and occult practices create a character whose supernatural persecution represents both literal supernatural threat and metaphorical exploration of how moral corruption ultimately leads to spiritual destruction. What rewards repeated viewing is the film's extraordinary visual design, which uses color symbolism, costume design, and set decoration to create a decadent aristocratic world where beauty and corruption coexist in supernatural suspension. Each room in Prospero's castle represents a different color and corresponding spiritual state, creating a symbolic geography where physical movement through the castle represents spiritual and moral progression toward final judgment. Vincent Price's performance as Prince Prospero creates a character whose intellectual sophistication and aesthetic refinement mask fundamental spiritual emptiness and moral corruption. His philosophical discussions about the nature of evil and divine justice create supernatural horror that operates through dialogue and character development, rather than simple shock effects, transforming the viewing experience into philosophical exploration of spiritual authority and moral responsibility. The Reptile, 1966. John Gilling's The Reptile creates supernatural horror through the exploration of colonial exploitation and cultural curse, using the transformation of an English woman into a serpentine creature to explore themes of cultural contamination, family secrets, and imperial guilt. The genius of The Reptile lies in its understanding that supernatural curses often represent the return of historical injustices that dominant cultures prefer to forget. The Spalding family's curse, resulting from Dr. Spalding's involvement with a Malaysian snake cult, creates supernatural horror that acknowledges how colonial exploitation creates spiritual debts that must eventually be paid. This connection between supernatural threat and historical guilt creates viewing experiences where horror serves as both entertainment and moral education. What makes this film essential for rewatching is its exploration of how supernatural curses operate through family inheritance, creating horror stories where children pay for their parents' moral failures. Anna Spaulding's transformation into the reptile creature represents both literal supernatural curse and metaphorical exploration of how cultural contamination and moral corruption can be passed between generations through family secrets and unacknowledged guilt. The Plague of the Zombies, 1966. John Gilling's The Plague of the Zombies creates supernatural horror through the exploration of labor exploitation and class conflict, using zombie resurrection to explore themes of economic oppression, medical authority, and social justice in rural communities. The power of The Plague of the Zombies lies in its treatment of zombie resurrection as supernatural extension of economic exploitation, creating horror stories where the undead represent literal continuation of labor abuse beyond death. The film's Cornish tin mine setting creates an authentic working-class environment where supernatural elements emerge from real economic and social tensions between landowners and workers. What rewards repeated viewing is the film's systematic exploration of how supernatural exploitation operates through corruption of legitimate authority figures, particularly medical and religious leaders who should protect community welfare. The local doctor's complicity with zombie resurrection creates horror stories about the betrayal of professional ethics and community trust, transforming medical authority into supernatural threat. The film's visual design creates some of the most effective zombie imagery of the 1960s, using makeup effects and cinematography to create undead creatures that represent both supernatural horror and social commentary about dehumanizing labor conditions. The zombie workers in the tin mine create viewing experiences where supernatural horror acknowledges real historical conditions of industrial exploitation and worker death. The Sorcerers, 1967. Michael Reeves's The Sorcerers creates supernatural horror through the intersection of scientific experimentation and occult power, using mind control technology to explore themes of aging, power, and vicarious experience that blur the boundaries between science fiction and supernatural horror. The brilliance of The Sorcerers lies in its understanding that supernatural horror can emerge from scientific attempts to transcend natural limitations, creating viewing experiences where technological innovation serves supernatural rather than rational purposes. Boris Karloff's performance as Professor Montserrat creates a character whose scientific experiments with mind control represent both genuine medical research and supernatural quest for renewed vitality through possession of younger subjects. What makes this film essential for rewatching is its exploration of how supernatural power can corrupt even well-intentioned individuals, particularly through the character of Estelle Montserrat, whose use of mind control technology to experience vicarious youth and excitement gradually develops into supernatural sadism and murder. Catherine Lacey's performance creates a character whose transformation from kindly elderly woman to supernatural predator acknowledges how power over others can corrupt even apparently harmless individuals. The film's treatment of mind control creates supernatural horror that operates through psychological possession rather than physical transformation, creating viewing experiences where supernatural threat works through the corruption of individual identity and moral agency. The controlled subject's gradual loss of autonomy and identity creates horror stories about the violation of consciousness and the destruction of individual will. The Shuttered Room, 1967. David Green's The Shuttered Room, based on an August Derleth story expanded from H.P. Lovecraft's notes, creates supernatural horror through the exploration of family secrets, rural isolation, and inherited trauma that spans generations. The genius of The Shuttered Room lies in its understanding that supernatural horror often emerges from family histories that remain hidden until external pressures force their revelation. Susanna Kelton's return to her ancestral island home creates a scenario where repressed family trauma manifests as supernatural threat, transforming inheritance into psychological and spiritual danger. What rewards repeated viewing is the film's systematic exploration of how family secrets can create supernatural vulnerability, particularly through the mysterious presence in the Shuttered Room that represents both literal supernatural threat and metaphorical exploration of family shame and hidden violence. The film creates viewing experiences where supernatural elements serve as externalization of psychological trauma that cannot be directly acknowledged or processed. The film's treatment of rural New England communities creates authentic social environments where supernatural elements emerge from real cultural tensions between traditional rural values and modern urban influences. The island setting creates physical isolation that serves both as supernatural trap and as psychological space where family histories can operate without external interference or social constraint. Now, Witchfinder General, 1968. Michael Reeves's Witchfinder General creates supernatural horror through historical setting and moral exploration, using the figure of Matthew Hopkins to examine themes of religious authority, political exploitation, and the corruption of justice during periods of social upheaval. The power of Witchfinder General lies in its understanding that supernatural horror can emerge from historical reality, creating viewing experiences where the monstrous behavior of supposedly civilized individuals becomes more terrifying than any supernatural threat. Vincent Price's performance as Matthew Hopkins creates a character whose legal authority and religious justification mask systematic torture, murder, and exploitation of vulnerable populations. What makes this film essential for rewatching is its systematic exploration of how religious and legal authorities can be corrupted during periods of social crisis, creating institutional horror that operates through legitimate channels of power and social control. The film's historical setting during the English Civil War creates authentic social conditions where supernatural accusations serve political and economic purposes rather than genuine spiritual concerns. Eye of the Devil, 1966. J. Lee Thompson's Eye of the Devil creates supernatural horror through the exploration of ancient pagan practices surviving within aristocratic French families, using themes of sacrifice, ritual obligation, and spiritual inheritance to create viewing experiences where supernatural elements emerge from cultural and religious continuity. The brilliance of Eye of the Devil lies in its treatment of pagan sacrifice as spiritual obligation rather than supernatural evil, creating horror stories where characters must choose between individual survival and fulfillment of ancient spiritual duties that transcend personal desires. David Niven's performance as Philippe de Montfaucon creates a character whose acceptance of ritual sacrifice represents both supernatural compulsion and genuine spiritual commitment to responsibilities that extend beyond individual interests. What rewards repeated viewing is the film's exploration of how ancient spiritual practices can continue within modern aristocratic families through tradition, property inheritance, and cultural continuity that operates independently of contemporary religious and social changes. The Montfaucon family's connection to pre-Christian spiritual practices creates viewing experiences where supernatural elements represent cultural memory and spiritual authority that predates and transcends Christian civilization. The film's treatment of the local peasant community creates authentic rural French social environments where supernatural elements emerge from genuine cultural tensions between aristocratic responsibility and individual desire, ancient spiritual obligation, and contemporary social expectations. The villager's expectation that Philippe will fulfill his ritual obligations creates social pressure that transforms supernatural horror into exploration of community responsibility and spiritual duty. The genius of 1960s supernatural cinema lies in its recognition that horror is most powerful when it emerges from character development and psychological realism, rather than arbitrary supernatural events. These films created supernatural experiences that feel inevitable given their characters' psychological states and social circumstances, transforming